This video is sponsored by Brilliant. Thwip. That was meant to be much cooler than it ended up being. So I know a lot of people have mixed opinions on the MCU Spider-Man movies. Specifically, I think Far From Home gets a lot of hate thrown its way for doubling down on the problems that Homecoming had and backtracking on the things that it got right. Right, like at least Homecoming tried to have some heartfelt scenes with Aunt May to establish Peter's home life and his outlook on the world through the person who raised him. Far From Home didn't want to even try to attempt that again for whatever reason. Homecoming had that fun sequence where New York felt like a character in Peter's story, helping cement him as a friendly neighborhood superhero. Far From Home put him in Europe. But I think probably worst of all, Homecoming had a villain who was really just angry at Tony Stark more than anyone, and then Far From Home did the exact same thing, to the point where now it is like a joke that every MCU Spidey villain doesn't actually care about Spider-Man and really just detests that Stark character. Follow me on Twitter. That being said, the villain from Far From Home was Mysterio, who's my favorite Spider-Man villain ever. So I actually really liked the movie on those grounds alone, and your criticisms will never be able to change my mind. Well, he was played by Jake Gyllenhaal, and Taylor Swift said I'm not allowed to like him anymore. Dang it. My point is, I feel these films are divisive. Even the previous Spider-Man franchises have had their fair share of fans and detractors, and I think that's because Spider-Man is supposed to be Marvel's everyman superhero. He's a hero we're supposed to relate to. We're meant to see ourselves in that webbed onesie.
Can I return it if it doesn't fit?
It always fits.
Peter Parker is just some guy. He struggles with his job and finances and personal life and alien symbiotes, just like the rest of us. Really gotta get that looked at. He was one of the first teenage superheroes who stood on his own at a time when most teenagers in comics were relegated to the role of sidekick. And the entire point of having sidekicks in the first place was to give the young readers someone to relate to. With Spider-Man, the kid is the hero. It was revolutionary. I mean, sure, we did have characters like Billy Batson, but he physically had to transform into an adult to become a superhero. Peter Parker doesn't gotta do that. Do you think I could eat this and be okay? And hey, look, not every superhero is supposed to be relatable, and that's okay. Sometimes it's refreshing to read a story about a moral paragon like Superman or Steve Rogers, characters who are unattainably good. Other times we like the escapist fiction of characters like Batman and Iron Man, you know, billionaires who actually want to help people. But Spider-Man is relatable. He reminds me of me. He reminds me of a slightly more coordinated me, and I want his stories to be good so that I will feel good. And with an entire Spider-Verse of Spider people, no Spider-Man has felt less relatable to me than the original. Peter Parker used to be a selfish, self-absorbed, ghoulish buffoon of a human back during his debut in the 1960s. Don't get me wrong, it makes total sense for Peter Parker to be an annoying little incel at the start of his origin story. He faces constant humiliation at the hands of his classmates that sows the seeds of his vengeful ego. Someday I'll show them. Someday they'll be sorry they laughed at me. So when he finally gets bitten by that radioactive spider and gains superpowers, Peter sees it as a turning point in his life where he'll never be bullied or pushed around ever again. He finally has the power to stand up for himself. He doesn't care about anyone else. So he lets a thief pass by because, hey, it's not his job to stop anyone, but uh-oh, that thief kills Uncle Ben, and Peter learns his lesson.
With great power, there must also always be great responsibility.
Or does he? We're gonna put a pin in that. But you can see that Peter Parker's self-obsessed attitude was set up so that he could fall hard later in the story and learn a lesson that will serve as his personal superhero creed. So that's fine. I'm totally fine with that. But you would think then that after this whole tragedy, Peter would be kinder to those around him, to not put himself at the center of the world, and to have more empathy toward others. And to be fair, for the first dozen or so issues, that is what happens. But then something weird happens. Slowly, Peter Parker starts to regress to his former angry, egotistical self. Not so he can learn a lesson again, but so he could teach readers the lesson that, yeah, with great power comes great responsibility, but that responsibility isn't to help others, it's to help yourself. Your self-interest is your number one priority, which sounds like what a supervillain would say, but no, this weird backward lesson was being preached in Spider-Man comics by Spider-Man himself, unironically, and it makes them so annoying to go back and read. In issue number 30, for example, Peter rips into Betty Brant with rage when she tells him that Ned Leeds proposed to her. I get the picture. Ned Leeds is the guy for you. I guess it was always him. Just what you want. A plain, hardworking, average Joe. Well, goody for both of you. Go ahead and marry him. You probably deserve each other. What difference does it make for me? A couple issues later, Betty sees Peter with bruises that he got fighting as Spider-Man, and she's visibly distraught and concerned for his safety because she loves him. But Pete's like, stop making a big deal of this. Things happen. Whatever. I'm not complaining. But I think probably the most famous example of Peter being an obnoxious twerp during this period was in issue number 38. He walks past a group of protesters who are protesting a protest meeting. Everyone involved is a caricature of student protesters. They don't actually care about what they're protesting about. They just want to be part of a group. Obviously, Peter doesn't care for these straw men and very intentionally tries to separate himself, standing away from the group. And now, I would like to flash back with you to the opening splash page of Spider-Man's origin comic. Peter Parker, standing alone, away from his peers, is meant to be sad. We're supposed to pity him. He's an outcast. He doesn't belong anywhere. Maybe someday he will, though. That's the hope. But now, a couple dozen issues down the line, being alone makes you strong. Having friends and caring about what they think and what they say and helping them with what they find important, well, that makes you weak. I hate this Spider-Man. This scene was so infamously bad that even modern comics made fun of how terrible it was. But this video is not going to be me sitting here and saying, thing bad. I feel like I've done that a lot recently, and I don't want that to be the vibe of this channel. I don't want to be Mr. Negative, even though I would look stellar in that suit. Instead, I want to talk about why Peter Parker's personality profoundly changed so much during this initial run of comics. Why did he go from angry loner kid to actually selflessly helping others might be morally good, to the world and everyone in it except me, baby? Why did Spider-Man suck? Unsurprisingly, it comes down to Spider-Man's co-creator, Steve Ditko. Ditko was an incredibly influential comics artist, but maybe not as beloved as Stan Lee or Jack Kirby, and he'd probably want it that way. He notoriously despised comic book fans. If you like Steve Ditko's work, you are nothing more than a grubby pack animal in his eyes. If you are critical of his work, then clearly you were trying to censor his brilliant mind. Much like Spider-Man, Steve Ditko wasn't always this awful. At least, I hope he wasn't. I'm not sure if he ever admitted to having his real-life experiences inform his creation of Spider-Man, but it's not hard to notice the similarities. Peter Parker was a lower-middle-class kid who was bullied for being a nerd. So was Ditko. Peter didn't have many friends, but he had a deep love for his family. Ditko only ever felt comfortable around his parents and siblings and was perceived as cold to anyone else. Peter Parker even looks like a young Steve Ditko. It's not hard to imagine that Steve saw Peter as a stand-in for himself. So when Ditko's entire worldview started to change during the mid-1960s, so too did Spider-Man's. But while Marvel eventually course-corrected their beloved hero to be a friendly face once again, Steve Ditko held on to his pessimism until his lonely death. How are you doing, you wonderful nerds? Scott here, and this is going to be another chill video with very light visual editing, so treat this one like you would treat a Hallmark Christmas movie. Just sort of have the audio on in the background while you wrap presents or obsessively clean your house because you don't think your family will like you if your place isn't spotless. You're correct, by the way. Let's start with some brief history about Steve Ditko, and I promise I tried to make this as brief as I could. Steve Ditko grew up in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, a town with a massive disparity between the upper class and middle class. The Ditkos were part of the latter, only made worse thanks to the Great Depression. They couldn't afford much for entertainment, so Steve and his siblings were taught to be creative with what they did have, and their creativity was inspired by the cheapest forms of pop culture around at the time: newspaper comic strips. By the 1940s, comic strips had evolved into comic books, and one of the premier characters was Bill Finger and Bob Kane's, but mostly Bill Finger's, Batman. The art for that book was eventually passed on to Jerry Robinson, who became an instant creative idol for Steve. He loved the Cape Crusader and even had his mom sew him a fully detailed Batman costume from scratch so he could reenact his favorite comic book stories, making Steve Ditko one of the world's first cosplayers, I think, which is fun. But he was bullied for being a dork because of it, which is less fun. Look, nobody should be bullied simply for liking superhero comics. There are plenty of legitimate reasons to bully Steve Ditko, and I will get to them. When he grew up, he served a little bit of time in the army, but he never lost sight of the magic of comic books. Ditko knew that he wanted to have a career as a comic book artist, a thing that nobody else wanted to do. The pay was low, the job security was non-existent, and because of this, most artists didn't put in a lot of time or effort into their craft because, well, why bother? It's just like YouTube. Oh man. But like this terrible hell site, there were people who poured their heart and soul into their artistry, compelled to make something special in an industry most people wanted to escape from. Steve Ditko was one of those people. Side note, I don't actually hate YouTube. That's just a bit that I do sometimes. I'm genuinely, constantly inspired by what artists make on this website. One day, I hope to be as good as the people that I look up to. And Steve Ditko is actually incredibly lucky because he had the fortune of working directly under his biggest inspiration. In 1950, he left his small town in Pennsylvania for the Big Apple to attend the School of Visual Arts, where he honed his artistic skill under Jerry Robinson, his idol. Robinson noted, though, that Ditko wasn't particularly gifted at drawing, but he was super focused on improving his art. And he would get to do just that a couple of years later when Steve Ditko was offered the deal of a lifetime at Charlton Comics. Here at Charlton, Steve Ditko was given full creative freedom to explore the comic book medium to the fullest in any way he wanted, writing and drawing any story he wanted, with no editorial oversight whatsoever. That's incredible. Charlton must have had a lot of faith in what Ditko would create. No, they just didn't care. Charlton Comics didn't even like comics, at least not initially. Their bread and butter at the time was printing magazines and song lyric sheets. And they found that it was less expensive to keep their giant presses running continuously rather than, turning them on and off and on and off and on. It was just more economical to just have them running all the time. They just needed more material to print. Any material whatsoever. They didn't care what it was. And as we know, comic book artists worked for almost nothing. So just to restate this, because I think it's funny, it was cheaper for Charlton to print comics than it was to not print anything. And that is the only reason they got into the comic book business. To Charlton, comics were just filler necessary to run their printing presses efficiently, and nothing more than that. The higher-ups did not care what the writers and artists came up with, providing no editorial oversight, nor concern if a book was selling well. This meant that Steve Ditko and all of the other artists that were working at Charlton had full, unhindered creative freedom to explore and experiment with the medium of comics. for about 6 months. Then they had to stop. Oh, that's right, nerds. Did you think I'd ever make a video that touches on the comics industry during the 1950s without bringing up this thing? It's important context, I swear. So by the early 1950s, the most popular comics being printed were not superhero comics, but shocking and lurid horror and crime comics. I love that word, lurid. I've got to use that more often. And Ditko aided this trend by pioneering spooky, richly atmospheric art at Charlton Comics. There's a quote that I always use by Blake Bell when discussing Ditko's art style because it's a very good quote. Quote, "His stories were scary regardless of what he drew." His effortlessly eerie style would become an incredible asset because by 1954, the public was worried about the effects crime and horror comics would have on their impressionable young children who are only one comic away from murdering their friends in a ritual sacrifice in the woods. So the Comics Code Authority was established, with publishers coming together to self-regulate their comic book stories and make them more suitable to readers of all ages through overly strict guidelines of what artists could, but mostly couldn't do. This tamed and nearly wiped out horror and suspense comic book genres almost overnight. The lurid tales that people bought them for no longer packed that same punch. Steve Ditko had been working at Charlton Comics for less than a year when these massive changes to the industry occurred, but it didn't seem to deter him too much. He was still able to tell truly unnerving tales without breaking the comics code. His artwork was inherently scary, and he showed it off in titles like Tales of the Mysterious Traveler and This Magazine is Haunted. Fantastic names. Look, I know people are gonna complain about like the clickbaitiness of the title I chose for this video, but back then they called a comic book This Magazine is Haunted. Despite massive odds, Steve Ditko was one of the only horror artists who truly made a name for himself after the Comics Code was put in place. And thanks to this, in the late 1950s, Ditko found work at Marvel Comics. He was tired of the low pay at Charlton and wanted to work with people who actually cared about the craft. Thankfully, the editor of Marvel, a man named Stan Lee, seemed to be genuinely enthusiastic about storytelling through comics. As we'll see later, this will turn out to be a bit of a monkey's paw situation. Now working full-time at Marvel, Ditko would illustrate stories in suspense anthologies like Strange Tales, Journey into Mystery, and Tales of Suspense. While these comics often featured dynamic monster-filled covers and stories by Jack Kirby, there'd almost always be a Ditko story tucked away in its pages. One of my personal favorites from this period at Marvel is from Tales to Astonish number 21, a 4-page collaboration with Stan Lee called It Happened on the Silent Screen. The comic tells a simple story about a monster named the Hulk, no relation to the big green boy. This monster may or may not have the ability to emerge from movie screens and terrorize the audiences watching it. The story is left intentionally unclear. The monster comes out of the screen, but no, wait, that's just part of the movie. No, wait, it's actually coming to attack the audience for real this time, but no, I guess it was just a movie within a movie? Or was it? What's real and what's fantasy? This comic is so simple on the surface, but it is a brilliant use of the medium. There's almost no dialogue, an extreme rarity in this era of comics, especially for Stan Lee. It is pure visual storytelling, not just through the images, but through the use of patterned panel layouts to create perfect timing, controlling your sense of fear. I could talk about this comic book for an entire hour, and maybe one day I will, but wow, this video is already so long. So at the very end of this story, it asks the readers to write in if they want to see more stories like this, if they want to see more collaborations between Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. And I just want you to appreciate here how rare it was at this time that Stan even wanted to work with another artist who wasn't Jack Kirby. The late comic book artist Don Heck once said that during this time in the 60s at Marvel, quote, Stan wanted Kirby to be Kirby, Ditko to be Ditko, and everyone else to be Kirby. And just think about that for a second. Yes, this sentiment obviously speaks to Jack Kirby's talent, but I'd argue it speaks to Steve Ditko's even more. Ditko was the only Marvel artist at the time who Stan Lee didn't want to emulate Kirby. Steve Ditko's artwork was allowed to be his own. But the question still lingers, right? Did fans actually want to see more collaborations between Stan Lee and Steve Ditko? The response was an overwhelming yeah, obviously, leading Marvel to launch a new comic book consisting entirely of stories by Lee and Ditko, called Amazing Adult Fantasy. Now, the book only lasted 15 issues, but that final issue? Whew, what a banger. Sitting down normally this time. I had to stop and make myself some herbal tea because I was talking so much and my throat was already getting sore, and we got a while to go in this video. So I guess this is a Sarah Zed video now. Now, the story goes that around 1962, Stan Lee approached then-publisher of Marvel Comics, Martin Goodman, about a brand new superhero that he was concocting called Spider-Man. Flat out, Goodman didn't like the idea of Spider-Man for many reasons. He was a teenager, which, as we already discussed, was actually an asset. He had too many real-life problems, which, again, is a thing that Stan Lee used to make him relatable. And number 3, most importantly, you can't have a superhero about spiders because spiders are scary. Which is ridiculous. Spiders are awesome. Paid for by the spider in the corner of your bedroom. Please just let me live here. Still, Goodman wouldn't let Spider-Man just have his own comic, at least not without proving that readers would actually like him. Now, Stan knew that the title he was working on with Ditko, Amazing Adult Fantasy, that was going to end around issue 15 or so. So he asked Goodman if the final issue could be dedicated to trying out this new perspective superhero, Spider-Man, just to, see what happens. But here's the frustrating thing. Stan enjoyed working with Ditko on horror and suspense comics, but I didn't really see him as much of a superhero artist. So, even though Amazing Adult Fantasy was a comic series created specifically so Stan and Ditko could work together, Stan's first instinct was to ask Jack Kirby to draw up Spider-Man, just sort of slapping Ditko in the face a little bit, like he wasn't allowed to work on the final issue of his own series. Not that it mattered much though. Stan wasn't impressed with Kirby's initial concept and design of Spider-Man. It involved a kid with a magic ring that turned him into a superhero. It was weird, and Ditko noted that the idea was perhaps a little too close to a superhero from another publisher named The Fly, so maybe it's best if Jack doesn't take the lead on this one. So, hey, Steve Ditko, bud, I'm gonna need you again. You're my shiny silver medal, Steve. Always knew you were the right person for the job. Never doubted you twice. And just like that, Ditko was once again allowed to work on the comic that, I'll remind you, was created specifically for him to work on. He drew the Wallcrawler's debut story in the final issue of Amazing Adult Fantasy, which had its name shortened to simply Amazing Fantasy. We all know the origin story. I went over it earlier. And unfortunately, that's the last we ever saw of this Spider-Man character. No, obviously, fans loved him a whole lot, and he quickly got his own comic book series in 1963. And while that series continued to be a collaboration between Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, that partnership began to crumble quite quickly, as Ditko grew more and more resistant to the creative input of others. As Blake Bell wrote in Stranger and Stranger, The World of Steve Ditko, quote, Ditko became the first work-for-hire artist of his generation to create and control the narrative arc of his series. Over the next 4 years, he would fight tooth and nail to maintain the strip's integrity before simply walking away from a multi-million-dollar franchise approaching the peak of its popularity. Now look, I've already made several videos appreciating Ditko's artwork on Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, so I'm not gonna rehash much of it here. Suffice it to say, I think it's spectacular. What I want to focus on in this video is the writing behind Spider-Man and the behind-the-scenes drama surrounding the title. Now, Stan Lee started out super hands-on with this series, injecting it with a typical Marvel grandiose. This made the first couple of stories seem a bit big for a brand new teenage superhero. Rescuing an astronaut, fighting space aliens, they just didn't seem as grounded in the life of a high schooler. I mean, Stan Lee's initial concept for Green Goblin was for him to be an ancient Egyptian demon that was released from a cursed sarcophagus, which would have made it extremely awkward in the first Raimi Spider-Man movie because that's Willem Dafoe's actual origin as a person. Ditko said no to that goblin idea. He had his own vision for Spider-Man and his foes and was unwavering about it. He also insisted, to the annoyance of Stan, that Spider-Man and Peter Parker should get equal screen time in the comics. Now, that didn't really start until around issue 4, but that issue is the first one that feels like a Spider-Man comic to me. Peter having to learn how to sew his costume back together, pretending to be sick so Aunt May doesn't get suspicious, getting in trouble at school and having conflict with his peers, those are all now hallmarks of Spider-Man's stories. And clearly Ditko was right to fight for it. It was clear that Ditko wasn't going to back down from what he wanted to do with the book. And you can understand why. He came to Marvel from Charlton Comics, where he never had to deal with editors breathing down his neck, telling him to add things and change things. Ditko wanted to work with people who cared about the art form. But he didn't think he'd have to work with them. And a finger on the monkey's paw curls. He was not open to much collaboration with others. He had his ideas, and he was going to do them. So, around a dozen issues in, Stan Lee officially forfeited the role of plotting the Spider-Man stories to Steve Ditko. He'd still work with Steve Ditko, at least a little bit, with notes here and there, but by issue 25, they had stopped communicating altogether. And this is when we start to see Ditko's worldview shift hard. Where once he wanted to be a part of a company who cared about comics, now he simply wanted to be left alone, to create on his own terms. Where early Spider-Man comics show Peter wanting to fit in and be respected by his classmates, now he rejects them. One of Spider-Man's first stories was him attempting to join the Fantastic Four, wanting to be a part of a superhero collective. But now, Spider-Man celebrates working alone. Steve Ditko's Spider-Man comics started implementing a philosophy that he would embrace for the rest of his life: the individual versus the collective. And it happened because he read an Ayn Rand book once and decided to base his entire personality around it. Oh ho, I have tricked you, for you see, this is not merely a video about Spider-Man comics. No, it is in fact a video about politics in Spider-Man comics. Whee! Okay, so a little history about Ayn Rand. Apologies. Ayn Rand was a 20th century writer who developed the philosophical system of objectivism. Now, to state the obvious, I am not a philosopher. I am a YouTuber, and those are mutually exclusive. My apologies, Abigail. So I'm going to condense objectivism down to its core ideas, and I promise I am not trying to intentionally misrepresent it or make it out to be some sort of weird straw man argument or something. It just always sounds fake to me. So in an extreme nutshell, objectivism states that there is no greater moral goal than achieving one's own happiness. Putting yourself first above all others is the greatest moral way to live your life. Being selfish is a virtue. And I know that sounds like I'm exaggerating, but it was literally the title of a book that Ayn Rand wrote. And to double down on it, objectivism rejects altruism. To go out of your way to help others, to be selfless, is exactly that. You become less of yourself, less of an individual, less of a person. As her character John Galt said in a book that really isn't anything of note, quote, "I swear by my life and my love of it that I will never live for the sake of another man, nor ask another man to live for mine." Don't live your life to help others. You don't owe them anything. Which, again, is a really strange idea for Ditko to put into his comics about superheroes who fight for others. There's a fun theory floating around that Steve Ditko might have first discovered Ayn Rand's work due to an interview that she did in Playboy magazine, because Ditko was sharing a studio space with fetish artist Eric Stanton at the time, and he often had Playboy on hand as reference material. If this idea is true, then that means Steve Ditko might be one of the only people in history who could claim he read Playboy, but only for the articles. But you can see this self-centered thinking starting to creep up into Ditko's Spider-Man. Over the first 2 issues, when Stan Lee was still mostly in charge of the plotting and dialogue, Peter wanted desperately to find a job so he could help Aunt May pay the bills. He agonized over this. It's both heartbreaking and sweet that he would sacrifice anything to help her. But then, in issue number 18, right as Ditko starts taking over more of the plotting duties, Peter wonders if he should give up being Spider-Man to protect Aunt May. He specifically says he wants to be the kind of kid that Aunt May wants him to be, effectively shaping his life around someone else. But Aunt May says, "Don't concern yourself with me. I'll worry about myself. You worry about yourself." And Peter's like, "Yeah, you're right. Only a weakling quits when times are hard. Sure, I've had my share of bad breaks, but who hasn't? But I've been wasting too much time in self-pity. I won't worry about Aunt May anymore, nor do I care what Jameson has to say. I'm Spider-Man. I'm special." I feel like the voice of Peter Parker that I do has changed every time that I've done it in this video. But you can see what made Peter return to the superhero role wasn't the responsibility he felt he had to protect others, but the conviction he felt to live up to the hero he believed he was born to be. Who cares what others think as long as you are stalwart in your own principles? Being a superhero isn't about other people, it's about what I want. Ayn Rand's focus with objectivist philosophy was to emphasize the individual rather than any kind of collective. And maybe, just maybe, that has to do with the fact that her very wealthy family became slightly less wealthy during the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, but, like Ditko, she denied that her life had any influence on her work. Sure. Rand pursued this theme in one of her 2 famous novels, The Fountainhead. And you know that Rand is a good writer because at the end of the story, she has the main character give a big speech about what the themes of the book are, and everyone nods like, "Oh yeah, good point."
I came here to say that I do not recognize anyone's right to 1 minute of my life.
Which is just an amazing line to say after you've been taking up everyone else's time by monologuing for no less than a full 5 minutes.
It is an ancient conflict. It has another name. The individual against the collective. The world is perishing from an orgy of self-sacrificing. My terms are a man's right to exist for his own sake.
And this is why Spider-Man went from wanting to join the Fantastic Four in ASM number 1 to insisting that he could handle everything himself. He went from wanting to be in a relationship with Betty to coldly pushing her away. And most infamously, this is why we have that protest scene in issue number 38. This was the final Spider-Man comic of Ditko's initial run, and he used it to just scream about his objectivist ideas. For some context, this comic came out in 1966. American support for the Vietnam War had already been declining, while the anti-war movement was only growing. Massive protests were being held all across the country, from California to New York. Living and working in New York, it's likely that Ditko witnessed some of these protests that happened in Central Park. In addition, civil rights protests had been happening throughout the decade. The march from Selma to Montgomery, where Alabama state and local police violently beat and brutalized protesters, happened just a year before this comic came out. Now here's a fun thing about Ayn Rand that isn't fun at all. Rand believed the government's only job was to provide 3 things. 2 of those things were armed forces and the police. So, of course, wanting to be an individual with his own free thought like objectivism treasures, Steve Ditko believed anything that Ayn Rand believed. Did Ditko care that the police were violently beating and hospitalizing black civil rights protesters? I don't know for sure, but my guess would be probably not. In fact, he began to deify the police in his Spidey comics, having them catch the bad guys before Spidey could, effectively communicating that altruistic superheroes are not as good or valuable as cops are. They're the real heroes, you know. Which makes sense. I suspect most cops are fans of the objectivist idea of never having to be held accountable to anyone but yourself. And seeing people protest the war, especially young people, almost certainly ticked Ditko off. Yeah, he was a veteran himself, but that's probably not why he hated anti-war protests. Tons of veterans opposed the Vietnam War at the time. I think what annoyed Ditko the most was that the Vietnam War was marketed. That feels like a wrong word. We're gonna go for it. The Vietnam War was marketed as the US trying to stop the spread of communism. Once again, we have the objectivist stance of valuing the individual over the collective. So Ditko made the protesters out to be a mindless horde of people with no actual values. They want to protest to save the world, but also they just want to use protests as a way to cut class and maybe get a picture of them in the newspaper. If Peter joins their protest meeting, they'll join one of his sometime. It doesn't matter what it is. They'll protest anything. Heck, they'll protest nothing. I mean, right now they're protesting a meeting about having another protest. They just like to be part of a group. I mean, look how angry Peter's face is here. He's supposed to be a lovable underdog, but he just comes across as a jerk. I mean, don't get me wrong. If these exact protesters existed in real life, I would be a little annoyed with them too, but they don't exist. Steve Ditko made up completely fictional people to get angry at. A classic tactic. I ran out of tea. Can you send me more, please? I have a P.O. box. To return to Ayn Rand for a second, I know, I'm sorry, but we have to. I think this line from The Fountainhead is probably what stuck out the most to Steve Ditko.
The creator stands on his own judgment. The parasite follows the opinions of others.
Something that Ditko fought Stan Lee on constantly was how much sway readers should have on the story. Remember how Ditko insisted that Peter Parker should have as much screen time as Spider-Man? Well, Stan Lee wasn't super happy about that at first. To try and satiate Stan's desire to see Spider-Man in costume more, Ditko cleverly came up with the split-face spider sense gimmick. It's truly iconic. So initially, Stan thought that was a super clever idea, 'cause it is. But a couple of fans wrote in saying that they hated it, which made Stan second guess the visual gimmick and challenge Ditko to remove it. Fans also complained that the way Steve Ditko drew characters like Aunt May and J. Jonah Jameson made them too ugly to look at, prompting Stan to ask Steve if he could, just beautify everyone, put it through Facetune, But Ditko fought Stan on every front, recalling, quote, Stan had the tendency to take write-in complaints too literally. Stan was too unsure of his own judgments. He felt he had to appease the others, outsiders, the complainers, because they knew what was best, ideas, values, etc., in Spider-Man. So just to spite readers who complained about his artwork, Ditko would purposely play up the things that they hated. Oh, Jameson is too ugly for you? I'm sorry. Here, I've made him bigger. I have to imagine Ditko enjoyed drawing Jameson with an unpleasing appearance because the character was almost like a stand-in for what he thought of the dissenting readers. Spider-Man could save the day against unbelievable odds, but the Daily Bugle would always smear him regardless. Peter just had to stand by his own beliefs and ignore the bad press. In much the same way, Ditko was doing this book the way that he wanted. He held on to his convictions, and no amount of Stan's interference or people writing in to tell him how much they didn't like him or his work would make him waver from what he believed was the right way of making Spider-Man. He didn't care what others thought. Just kidding, he did. In his later years, Ditko would regularly write essays about his thoughts and beliefs about the comic book industry, and specifically his unbridled detest for comic book fans. Those essays were compiled in a book called The Complete 4-Page Series and Other Essays by Steve Ditko, but one review on Amazon helpfully described it as libertarian rantings you can get for free from any libertarian on the internet. So of course I bought it because I thought making fun of it would be good content, and I was right. He has a 2-page essay in here about anti-Ditko fans. It seems to be targeted directly at me making this video right now. It's amazing. It's about how comic book fans who oppose Ditko's Randian views are literally censoring him. Quote, certain thoughts, ideas, themes, free will choices, story ideas, art, and dialogue are to be forbidden. Violators like me must be abused, punished, stopped, silenced for the good of all. I have no right to offer, do my created idea material in the marketplace where potentially interested buyers are free to buy or pass it by, go their own way. Some higher authority, fan group power must decide what is fit for all. So first off, my apologies to the comma key on Ditko's keyboard. You have unfairly suffered the brunt of his rantings. Secondly, and I hope this is obvious, I'm not here to cancel or silence Steve Ditko. I've said a lot of nice things about him in this video. I just think his views on life and politics are extremely bad. Well, I guess that makes me one of the titular anti-Ditko fans, in air quotes. Well, these are real quotes. They're printed quotes. I would have done air quote. You get it. If it wasn't already clear, Ditko loathed comic book fans. He went to very few conventions, and when he did, he recoiled at the sight of mass hordes of fans that he referred to as no more than pack animals. He felt utterly repulsed by people who based their entire personality around fictional storybooks. Unless those books were written by Ayn Rand, I guess. I mean, just listen to how he responds to fans who simply wanted more information about a Spider-Man comic he wrote. One CBF, comic book fan, wanted some information about a specific idea I had used in Spider-Man in the 1960s. Many CBFs were publicly irritated, upset, annoyed, complaining, angry about my poor, inadequate, evasive, not fully detailed, documented answer. Why does he write like that? Oh my God. So, I have a duty to write a completely detailed, day by day, hour by hour, thought by thought, factually comprehensive, fully documented answer. It must always be done when any CBF asks, wants, needs, must know, is entitled to, owed some wish, want, need, or curiosity. Whatever. Everything should have been dutifully, accurately, properly recorded, filed, available, and all to be judged by the CBF's infallible, absolute standards. Ditko is one of those people who would write in his Tinder bio that he's fluent in sarcasm. I mean, he wrote this and published it because some fans wanted to know more about him. And the rants, I mean, they continue page after page of this. You could have just kept this all to yourself, Steve. If you like comic books, Steve Ditko spent the last years of his life passionately writing about how much he hates you. And when people try to comment, not even criticize, just comment the fact that Ditko is clearly a fan of Ayn Rand, he neither confirms nor denies it, instead choosing to devolve into pedantry. One truth in an article about me claims that I am a lifelong admirer of Ayn Rand. Lifelong means what? From the first day of my life? The first day I could speak, read, write, draw, first day in school, first Playboy I read? No, I'm kidding, it doesn't say that. And with that, I have had enough of this book. Now, look, I get it. Reading negative opinions on your work is not exactly encouraging or motivating to keep at it. I tend to only read the comments on my videos for like the first hour after it goes live because those come from the people who have notifications turned on just so they can say nice things about me and prove that they can write funnier jokes than I can. After about a day, the comments become complaints about the way I look and talk and think. And, maybe at least a little bit of that is on me. Sometimes I antagonize the comment section, which gives the negative commenters more attention while discouraging people who would have otherwise left nice comments from writing anything at all. For whatever cruel psychological reason, hurtful comments stand out more than nice ones. But you can check the letters section of any Spider-Man comic from Ditko's run, and so many fans were writing in about how much they loved his art. But one person hated the way he drew feet, so he had to subtweet them. So Steve Ditko definitely did care about what others thought about him and his work, at least enough that any complaints would annoy and anger him. But that's not what a good objectivist is supposed to feel. Don't concern yourself with what others think, just stay true to your own beliefs, because the opinions of others don't matter. Right, Ayn Rand? Uh-oh. Yeah, turns out the person who trumpeted individualism and originality, detesting those who conform to collectives and hating people who always sought the approval of others, hated being around people who disagreed with her politically and philosophically so much that her close circle of friends, cult, literally called themselves the collective. And anyone who expressed views that even a little bit opposed objectivist thinking was interrogated, cult. And anyone who displeased Rand by not being loyal enough to her ideas was excommunicated from the cult. It was a cult. The great individualist thinker ran a cult. But perhaps the end of this line from the Fountainhead hit Ditko especially hard, and I can understand why.
The creator stands on his own judgment. The parasite follows the opinions of others. The creator thinks. The parasite copies. The creator produces. The parasite loots.
Now, this rhetoric was used by Rand to promote and glorify laissez-faire capitalism, so to be clear, I definitely don't agree with that part. Looting was terminology that Rand used to describe things like taxes, and anyone who benefits from anything that those taxes pay for is themselves a looter. Like, just for a random example, a person who receives financial assistance from government welfare programs. If I had to give that hypothetical person a name, I guess I'd call them Ayn Rand, because Ayn Rand did that while condemning others who did the same thing. Go away. She's dead. Go more away somehow. Also worth noting that Steve Ditko was only able to pursue comic book artistry because he received financing from the government's GI Bill of Rights, which provided academic assistance to veterans, which he used to take art classes under his idol, Jerry Robinson. Remember that detail I told you about like an hour ago? And good, I'm not saying either of these two shouldn't have taken financial assistance. I'm glad that there are systems in place to help out the elderly and veterans. I think those systems should be more robust, to be honest. And we should also have more ways to help all people. But the hypocritical attitude of, it's okay for me, but not for thee, that's just ridiculous. But okay, back to the actual point I was trying to make. Can you tell a big reason I wanted to make this video was so I could dunk on Ayn Rand? Not only was some of this looter and producer terminology used explicitly in Spider-Man comics. I mean, one of Spidey's villains from Ditko's run was literally called the Looter. Bit on the nose, Steve. But I also think it's something that Ditko saw about himself compared to the others that he worked with. During his run on Spider-Man, Steve Ditko unquestionably defined the character and his world, for better or worse. He plotted the stories long before he was even given credit as the series plotter. He came up with iconic characters and story beats and powerful moments that Stan Lee would take credit for decades.
He had complained to me a number of times when there were articles written about Spider-Man which called me the creator of Spider-Man. And I had always thought I was, because I'm the guy who said, I have an idea for a strip called Spider-Man. So I said to him, well, I think the person with the idea is the person who creates it. And he said, no, because I drew it.
And worst of all, Spider-Man was popular. Officially licensed merchandise was sprouting up all over the place. There was even talk of a series of Marvel cartoons that were about to head into production. I wish someone made a video about those. Those sound fun. I did. I made some. Please go watch them. They gave me an anxiety attack. All the way back during Spider-Man's creation, Marvel's publisher Martin Goodman promised Ditko a percentage of the royalties if the character ever got popular. Spider-Man became Marvel's most popular superhero probably ever, and Ditko saw nothing from it. All of that merchandising money most likely went to Goodman. The artist saw nothing.
The creator produces, parasite loots.
Rand probably didn't intend for that quote to rightfully label workers as producers and company heads as looters, but this is as unintentionally based as Ayn Rand will ever be. And look, Ditko was right to be angry here. Marvel has a long history of not properly crediting or paying their artists. It's still going on today. I hate it. And if the constant squabbles that Ditko had with Stan Lee weren't enough, the lack of promised royalties for his characters was the final straw. If he wasn't going to be fairly compensated for his ideas, then he'd take his ideas somewhere else. Somewhere new. Just kidding, he went back to Charlton Comics. Hey, remember earlier when I said that Ayn Rand only thought the government should be used for 3 things, and 2 of them were the military and the police? Well, the third one was objective judges. Judges who knew that right and wrong was a simple matter of black and white. There's never any moral gray area. All actions are either fully right or fully wrong, and we need people who can reinforce. Aw, dang, this guy's cool. Look, this video is just supposed to be about Ditko's run on Spider-Man. I can't write another 5 pages about Mr. A or The Question, or how Rorschach was created by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons as a parody of Steve Ditko's objectivist ideals. Do you get it? His mask is literally a thing that everyone interprets differently using their own subjectivity. There is no objective view of it. Rorschach is a joke, and if you like him, you've missed the entire point. All of that could be and should be, and probably is already, its own video is somewhere on YouTube. We are exclusively talking about Ditko's run on Spider-Man here. And I want to clarify one last time that I don't think it's all bad. A lot of the stories from this era were phenomenal. Steve was a tremendous artist who understood the medium of comics more than most at the time. And the ideas Steve Ditko pushed back on against Stan Lee were incredibly formative to the character. But Spider-Man wasn't wholly a product of Steve Ditko. Stan Lee also pushed back against Ditko's ideas. Most famously, Steve Ditko wanted the reveal of Green Goblin to be just like some random criminal somewhere, no name or anything. They had been building up the reveal, the identity of this character for months, and Ditko wanted it to be intentionally unsatisfying. Stan said no. In a grand twist, Green Goblin was going to be Norman Osborn. And I think we can all agree that Stan had the right call here. And again, recall that Stan's original idea for Gobby was supposed to be an ancient supernatural entity instead of a person in a costume. It's almost like when the two of them worked together and listened to each other's ideas, even if they did so begrudgingly, they made good art. Steve Ditko died in June of 2018 due to a heart condition. He had shut himself out of the world for decades. He refused to give interviews or make public appearances or let any details about his personal life be known to the public. As far as we know, he didn't have any close friends or family left. We don't know the exact date of his death because no one was there when it happened. Officials reported that he may have been dead for days before his body was found. An individual to the lonely end. If there's one thing that I hope you can take away from this video, it's that working with others to create more good in the world doesn't make you less of a person. Caring about others doesn't make you weak. And that's what we need superheroes to embody. I adore the Peter Parker who's kind and who worries about his friends and family. I admire the Spider-Man who sacrifices himself for others, not because it's what he wants to do, but because he feels that call of responsibility to help his community. That's the Spider-Man I loved as a kid. That's the Spider-Man who feels relatable. And without that, under Ditko's Randian objective views, we might technically have a Spider-Man, but he could never, ever be the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Are you happy, Rand? I explicitly and bluntly stated the entire message of my video at the end. I'm a good writer, just like you. And you know, diving back into these comics about a young school-aged Peter Parker made me reflect on my school days. I had no idea growing up how much of my life and career was gonna be sitting at a computer. Those were just machines that teachers let us play games on sometimes. Nowadays, obviously, computers are everywhere. I'm sitting in front of one right now, and I only occasionally play games on it. But I regret not learning more about computer science when I had the chance. I'm actually in the process of learning a new editing software right now, and it is wild how much coding there is in editing and animation. Genuinely, so much of my job would be much easier if I understood how computers speak, and that's where today's sponsor, Brilliant, can help. Brilliant is an online learning platform for STEM that replaces lecture videos with hands-on interactive lessons. Brilliant is for curious learners, both young and old. Like me, I'm almost 30. It's also for both people who are professional and inexperienced. So if you're like me and you've always wanted to learn how computer programming works but were put off by opaque coding language, then Brilliant is a massive help. With Brilliant, you can learn how to program without having to dig through the weeds of coding syntax through these fun, interactive challenges. You just shift around these blocks of pseudocode and then you get immediate feedback on your results. It's a fantastic way to understand how computer algorithms work, and then once you have that down, the coding syntax becomes a lot less intimidating. Brilliant has tons of interactive STEM courses that you can get hands-on with. Just pick a course you're interested in and get started. They're all designed by award-winning instructors and built upon the principle of active learning. So you're gaining STEM knowledge by actually doing it. And the first 200 of you to go to brilliant.org/nerdsync, link in the description, will get 20% off of your annual premium subscription to Brilliant. Once again, that's brilliant.org/nerdsync, 20% off of your annual premium subscription, link in the description. Thank you to Brilliant for sponsoring this video and for helping me finally learn how to code. If you want an analysis of Steve Ditko's artwork, here's a video I made about why Spider-Man and Doctor Strange make the same hand gesture. Or here's a playlist analyzing the 1966 Marvel cartoons. They're wacky. Once again, my name is Scott, reminding you to explore your favorite art through curiosity and vulnerability. See ya.